We are continuing on. This is Unit 2, Lecture 2. Today's lecture is going to cover the different parts of the brain. You guys are going to be assigned a project, a superhero brain project for this unit, and today's lecture is extremely important for that project, and also because we're going to be continuously building on to the brain. At any point in time in the rest of the semester, you could have a random pop quiz on the brain and the functions of the parts of the brain. So please make sure that you know this, and unfortunately a lot of it's going to be just rote memorization. We will start by talking about the oldest brain structures. This is the brainstem. The brainstem is the oldest part of the brain from an evolutionary perspective. All species have some form of the brainstem because the brainstem is responsible for automatic survival functions. And the brainstem is physically located where the spinal cord swells and enters into the skull. A lot of the parts that are included in the brainstem cover things that we need to survive. And if something happens, if you damage part of your brainstem, there is a high risk that you yourself would not survive. So let's jump right in and talk about the medulla. The medulla is at the base of the brainstem. You can see it right here. You've got the brainstem extending from the spinal cord, and the medulla is at the base of this brainstem. It controls automatic functions and relays nerve signals between the brain and the spinal cord. The medulla is specifically involved in respiration, blood pressure, heart rate, reflexes, and vomiting. So you can see without the medulla functioning correctly, there's a high rate that you could stop breathing, that your blood pressure would be unregulated, that your heart rate would not be consistent if beating at all. Your reflexes like vomiting is a natural reflex. If your medulla is damaged and you cannot vomit, there is a high chance that you could potentially choke to death. So the medulla is part of the brainstem and it is important for automatic functions. The second part of the brainstem is the reticular formation. This part of the brainstem is important for attention, cardiac reflexes, motor function, arousal specifically. There's a lot of regulation of awareness that happens within the reticular formation, and it relays nerve signals to the cerebral cortex. That's the outermost part of the brain. And it also plays an important role in sleep. It's a nerve-like network, as you can see, and your book talks about what happens if you electrically stimulate the reticular formation or sever it. If it's electrically stimulated in a cat, they have found that the cat becomes wide awake. Again, this is dealing with awareness. However, if you sever the reticular formation, the cat will be induced into a coma that it will never wake up from. So you can see the reticular formation has a lot to do with awareness, and again, it's that automatic survival function. The pons is another part of the brainstem. It links the medulla to the thalamus, and it is known as a relay station for sensory information. Pons is actually, I believe, Latin for bridge. So it's relaying sensory information from one part of the brain to the other. For example, if information from your ear first enters the brain, it's going to go through the pons. The pons is also important for levels of consciousness and for sleep. Again, it's part of the brainstem, which is dealing with automatic survival functions. And then the last part of the brainstem is the thalamus. This is the brain's sensory switchboard, and it's located at the tip top of the brainstem. This is the most important part of the brain for relaying information from one part of the brain to the other. So for example, when you hear something, your sense of your ear, that information is going through your ear, transmitted through the pons and the thalamus, goes to other parts of the brain that help you process what you're hearing. The thalamus also transmits and replies information from the cerebellum and the medulla. We'll talk about the cerebellum in just a second. An easy way to remember the thalamus is because it is like this little sensory switchboard. Think of it as a telephone operator, an old school telephone operator. When the operator answers the phone, she says, "Thala, may I help you?" And she's going to transmit your call to where you need it to go. That's exactly what the thalamus does with sensory information in the brain. The cerebellum sits at the top of the thalamus. It is not part of the brainstem, but it is important, kind of subpart of the brainstem, I should say. It's at the rear of the brainstem. The cerebellum helps to coordinate voluntary movements and balance. It extends from the rear of the brainstem and is important for motor movement, specifically balance. So if you get in a car wreck and your cerebellum is damaged, you could potentially have an issue walking again. Your book talks about soccer players. Their cerebellum must be operating efficiently in order for them to be able to play the game well. Now, the second part of the brain we're going to talk about is the limbic system. This is a donut-shaped system of neural structures at the border of the brainstem and the cerebellum. And the limbic system is really important because it deals with emotions such as fear, aggression, and drives for food and sex. This is kind of your reward center, this limbic system. When you do something that makes you feel good, your limbic system is activated and it makes you want to do that activity again. The limbic system, the parts of the brain that are included within the system are the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the hypothalamus. And you can see here we have the brainstem. The limbic system is on top of the cerebellum, which is known as the little brain. And here, this is your reward center. Now, the amygdala is the part of the brain that deals mostly with emotions of fear and anger. It's two almond-shaped neural clusters, as you can see here, and it's really important for the regulation of fear and anger. The hypothalamus is involved with maintenance activities like eating, drinking, the regulation of our body temperature, and also the hypothalamus deals a little bit with the control of emotions. It helps govern the endocrine system via the pituitary gland. So remember, in the last lecture, we talked about how the endocrine system releases hormones, and the hormones are controlled by the pituitary gland, which is the master gland. The hypothalamus is governed by that gland. So if your pituitary gland isn't working, you could potentially have issues with your hypothalamus, such as perhaps you're not eating enough, or you're eating too much, or your body temperature is not able to be regulated. An easy way to remember the hypothalamus is the 4Fs. The hypothalamus regulates 4Fs: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and sex. The 4Fs. Got it? The next part of the brain we're going to talk about is the hippocampus. This is found within the limbic system, and it is responsible for memory. It's responsible for STM, which is short-term memory, and specifically it's really responsible for helping transmit information from our short-term memory to our long-term memory. There's also some scientists who believe that the hippocampus plays an important role in spatial information. So when we look at a map, or when we come out of a store in a mall and we try to figure out how to get back to our car, your hippocampus is retrieving those memories that you stored in your short-term memory and helping you recall where you should be going. Hippocampus is very important with memory storage. Now, the cerebral cortex is what you see if you look at a brain like in a jar, in a movie or in a book. The outermost part of the brain is known as the cerebral cortex. It covers all of the hemispheres. There are 2 hemispheres, and it also covers the 4 lobes. It is the body's ultimate control and information process center. The larger your cortex is, the higher capabilities, the higher functions you're going to have as a species. So human cerebral cortex are much larger than a slug cerebral cortex. That shows that we have evolved, our brains have evolved from just this basic brainstem to these higher level functions, or higher level parts of the brain. Now, the structure of the cortex, there are 4 lobes. You've got the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. The frontal lobe is at the very front of the brain, as you can see here, and because there are 2 hemispheres, you've got a frontal lobe on the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. The frontal lobe is involved in higher mental functioning. The frontal lobe helps us plan for events that are going to happen in the future. Some people think that parts of our personality are stored here, and the frontal lobe is important for decision making. It helps us make decisions as humans, make good decisions. The parietal lobe is right behind the frontal lobe. This lobe is responsible for information regarding our senses. So anything dealing with touch or body temperature or our body position in space, are we sitting, standing, laying down, and also taste. All of that is processed in the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe is in the back of your head, and this is important for visual information. You've probably heard, I remember when I was little, my sister fell off a stool and hit the back of her head, and my mom was really concerned that she might have some type of vision problems because of that. That's because the occipital lobe is found in the back, and it regulates or is important in visual information. The temporal lobe is where your temples are, right above your ear, and this is important for auditory information. If you think about the physical spot of the temporal lobe in your brain, it's right above your ear, and it's going to help you process auditory information. Now let me tell you a little bit about Phineas Gage. He was a railroad worker in the 1800s, and he was working one day. A really nice guy. He was known as a peacemaker, would always kind of intervene when two people weren't getting along. He was working one day on the railroad where a piece of iron, because they were working with explosives, shot through his neck and all the way out the top of his skull. It went through his eye. So it's literally, this is the tamping iron or tamping rod that went through his body, that went through his head. It goes through his neck and out his skull. He immediately sits up, despite having this horrific thing happen to him. He's talking, he's aware. He's rushed to the doctor at that time, and of course this is a long, long time ago, so they don't have the medical technology that we have today. But he survives the incident. You can see he did lose his eye. He's able to walk and talk. But one of the things they noticed is his personality completely changed. He was no longer this pacifist, this easygoing guy. In fact, he would easily become very irate and angry. He wasn't able to make decisions. His planning capabilities completely fell to the wayside. And this gives us a lot of information about the frontal lobe. What they figured out is that the tamping rod went through his frontal lobe, and it severed his frontal lobe from the rest of his brain. Therefore, all of these things that the frontal lobe is important for, Phineas Gage no longer had the capability to do. So because we have cases like Phineas Gage, we have learned what these parts of the brain are responsible for, and we will continue talking about them for the rest of the semester. Now, at the back of the frontal lobe, you have the motor cortex. The motor cortex is responsible for voluntary movement, so raising your hand in class or getting up because you have to go to the bathroom. Your motor cortex is involved in that. That's found in the back of the frontal lobe. The parietal lobe has or encompasses the sensory cortex. This is giving you information about your skin surface and sense organs. So you've got the frontal lobe, motor cortex that deals with voluntary motor movements. At the back of the motor cortex, at the front of the parietal lobe, you've got the sensory cortex. These are important for regulation of both motor movement and also skin surface information. And then at the back of the occipital lobe, you have the visual cortex, which is responsible for what you're seeing. And at the temporal lobe, you have the auditory cortex. And what they have found is when you put someone through an MRI machine, when we look at pictures, the scientists actually see parts of our visual cortex lighting up. If you are in an MRI machine and someone is talking to you, your auditory cortex and your temporal lobe is going to light up. So we have the technology now that helps us figure out what these different parts of the brain do.